So in the last video, we looked at how slavery began to establish a structural and institutionally racist system, which gave preferences to white people at the expense of enslaved people. And it's important to note that even though slavery ends with the 13th Amendment at the end of the Civil War, you have, while it ends legally, theoretically, almost immediately the South begins to institute what are called black codes. And the black codes were ways that Southern governments could imprison blacks for things like vagrancy, which means being in outside after dark and things like that. And so a lot of young African American men were enslaved or not enslaved, they were imprisoned and then effectively re-enslaved because they had to go back to work in the fields, and they were working in the same conditions that they were in before. And the other thing that happens after the abolition of slavery, as soon as 1865, it really starts coming in a little later after Reconstruction ends about 1877. Reconstruction was a period where the northern governments came in and tried to provide basic rights to black people in the South. And so there was some effort to try and provide, and there was major progress. It was made not just by the white Northerners that helped do this with some Southern allies. It happened because black people took control and began to take advantage of a more free society. But just as their freedom, again, their political freedom and their educational freedom and all this was starting to emerge, in comes a new system. And this new system, again, economic system, was sharecropping. And sharecropping was a system where, particularly for agricultural workers, black workers in the agricultural South, were basically forced back onto the land. In many cases, the land that they had been working as enslaved people. Now they're working on it as sharecroppers, which meant that the white landowner would give them a plot to work on, and they would pay him back for the rent for this property in cotton or in whatever the farm product was going to be. And of course, they eventually would fall into debt to the white landowner. And this is, again, sort of debt slavery. They would never be able to leave. They would be stuck on the land working under the same sorts of conditions, extremely brutal work, being exploited. The white owners were getting a lot of the profits. The black people were getting very little of them, and they were being exploited. And when I ask how much better is it than slavery, in slavery, you had the white plantation owner had an incentive to make sure that his workers were healthy, well fed, but in sharecropping, he didn't care about any of that. It was just, am I getting paid or not? Am I getting the cotton that you owe me or not? And so in many cases, the oppression of sharecropping was just about the same as it was with slavery. So you were free, at least theoretically, although most black agricultural workers couldn't actually vote because the white people had control of the government, and they wouldn't be able to do that. And this was backed up with a whole form of racial terrorism, which we'll talk about another time. And it was also backed up by a system called convict leasing, which becomes increasingly prominent in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, remember we talked, or I just was talking about the black codes, which was the enslavement, effectively re-enslavement of young black boys in the period just after the war. Well, here what you have are a number of young black boys who were either orphaned or vagrants. Vagrants meaning that many of them were actually looking for work, and they'd be arrested, and then they would be asked for bail, and then they couldn't pay the bail, and then they would be convicted, usually by white juries, and given long prison sentences, and then they were then leased out to the plantations to work on that land. So again, we're right back into the same idea of black servitude, working for white plantation owners, for white business owners. Shockingly, when I went to Montgomery, Alabama a couple of years ago, I was looking at some pictures in a museum about convict labor, and I saw pictures like these. These pictures were taken about 2 years ago. And when I saw them, I was just stunned because I wasn't fully aware of the extent to which convict leasing still is present. So Angola prison, which is one of the largest prisons in the country, Angola is right in the middle of the plantation belt in Louisiana. As you can see, mainly black prisoners. 75% of people there are black. All the guards are white. All the people that own this plantation land are all white. And if you look at what's happening here, these people many of these men are serving long prison sentences, everything from assault to violent crime. And they're being worked 40 hours a day, 20 cents an hour. And this is actually punishable. If you don't work the 40 hours a week, you can be put in solitary confinement. Which is effectively not that far away from what they did on the plantation, where they would put you in a house at the edge of the plantation to punish you. So the 13th Amendment prohibits slavery except as a punishment for a crime. So here's your loophole, right? Because these are criminals, they are allowed to work for essentially nothing, again, providing enormous wealth to the white landowners in the area. I don't know why it was stunning to me. I just couldn't believe that this was still happening today, and it certainly is, continues to happen. So if you look at this again, this alongside with sharecropping, again, for most of the 20th century, this was the case. So if you really look at it with the Jim Crow laws and segregation laws going in alongside of this, with lynching and the terrorism against African Americans throughout this period, backing all of this up, you have the systematic oppression of Southern African Americans. And so when you see this great migration to the North, it isn't just about economic freedom. They're fleeing from terrorism. They're fleeing from white people who are imprisoning them, lynching them, threatening them. And then, of course, when they get to the North, they're only allowed to live in certain areas of the North. So the formation of the ghetto was not a creation of what the African American people wanted. It was what white people basically, where they let them live. So if you look at this, most of you know about redlining and you know how it works. But redlining was only possible because white people had already, through restrictions in the way that houses were sold, and because most houses were owned by white people, they wouldn't sell them to people of color. And that meant the only places that you could buy property were already in the areas that were settled by black people. So you have the systematic racism and institutional racism leading to the black ghetto. But then you have the reinforcement of it through redlining. And the way that redlining worked was you couldn't get a housing mortgage, which meant you couldn't get a loan from a bank to buy a house if you lived in the areas that were outlined in the red. So if you look at the area, you can see those areas in red. Those were areas where black people lived. So basically, if you were black, lived in a black area, you could not buy a house anywhere else. So you were stuck. And the thing that provides upward mobility in this country is land ownership and house buying. And so as white people in the 1950s moved in huge numbers from urban areas to suburban ones, those suburban areas were almost entirely white. And that was not simply by some magical act. It was done because of bank policy, and it was done because those communities made sure that those areas stayed white. And it was backed by banks who said, look, we don't want to have property in the suburbs lose its value because black people move in. So we're going to make sure that basically because we were guaranteeing our investment, that we're going to back up these racist restrictions on black people moving to higher value areas to live. And of course, not only were the property values higher, the schools were better, all of those things. So the creation of the white suburbs was a continuation of this institutional racist development. Now, for a long time, this is in place. Eventually, you get obviously to the Civil Rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This ends some of this earlier oppression, at least politically, in terms of rights. But we want to look at it in terms of economics. So what happened? As soon as, I sound familiar, just like after the Civil War, as soon as blacks are given more rights and freedoms, and those rights are guaranteed by the government, what happens? That same government begins to criminalize black people. In this case, it's going to be inner city black people, and it's going to be through drug enforcement policy. So blacks who were in possession of marijuana or cocaine were given long prison sentences. My first teaching job was in a medium security prison in Trenton, New Jersey, and all of my students were black. All of them were in for minor drug offenses, all of them in for long periods of time. And they were part of the beginning of this mass incarceration, which started in the 70s and has really continued all the way up until today. So what happened? Obviously, this is easy to explain. Why is it that the family income gaps are so large? Because whites have always been in a position where they've had more opportunity. Why is it that median net worth, net worth is basically how many your resources that you have? If you take all of the things together, whites have 10 times the amount that blacks have. And this is the result, basically, this is what happens if you take hundreds of years and you give racial preference to white people over black people, you're going to have outcomes that look like this. So when you argue that, well, that's because white people are, work harder or more successful or whatever racist things you want to argue, you're denying the reality of the history. And the reality of the history is the racial preferences and the ability of white people to collect wealth and at the expense of black people. Now, mass incarceration, referred to as Michelle Alexander as the new Jim Crow, this has tremendous implications. Felons can't vote; they're removed from the voter rolls. Felons lose job opportunities. If you ever have gone to a job interview and you look at the job application, it says you've ever been convicted of a felony, you lose a job usually if you check that box. If you don't have access to public and private housing, it's going to segregate you even further. You're going to be marginalized in your own community. And so what you've done is you basically have created a whole generation of young black men who have been effectively segregated both in prison and then even after prison. So the implications of this are overwhelming. If you look at the statistics, if you look at the rates of incarceration and poverty rates, this is another way of looking at the previous graph I showed you. And the other piece of this is what happens to trauma, and particularly for people of color. This is a little hard to see, but what you see is again, but whether it's psychological or physiological, emotional abuse, all the things that go with poverty. So the trauma that African Americans experience in general is going to reduce their life expectancy, and this type of trauma is passed down epigenetically, which is a fancy way of saying it's inherited to a certain extent. So the results of this oppression are extremely significant, and I think it's particularly if you are a white person listening to this, it's worth thinking about the extent to which this institutional racism impacts Black people and how it impacts not just their economic